Hi, I'm Paul Holmes, Chairman of the Oral History Committee at the Surfing Heritage Foundation here in San Clemente. And I'm here with three very notable personas in the form of Fred Hemmings from Hawaii, Patti Paniccia, who used to live in Hawaii and now lives in California, and Randy Rarick, who lives in Hawaii. These three people collectively were kind of responsible for the startup of the World Professional Tour of surfing. We're going back now to the mid-1970s. Fred Hemmings was an ex-world champion and a contest promoter. Fred, tell us a little bit about how you became a contest promoter instead of a competitor, and how that worked into the formative stage of a World Pro Tour.
Paul, I would love to tell you, and it's a long story, but before I do, I'd like to say that I think all of surfing owes a debt of gratitude to Spencer Crawl and Dick Metz for all they've done to preserve surfing heritage. We have a lot of surfers who've gained notoriety and fame riding waves, and these men have contributed significantly to our heritage and the substance of who we are. And secondly, they have done something that's really important to me, and I know Randy and I have talked a lot about it. History can be easily distorted for political purposes or whatever cultural purposes. I remember hearing once that the Australians taught Duke how to surf. So it's really important that we, thanks for laughing, Randy. It's really important that we truly preserve the facts about surfing history for future generations, so that some with an agenda doesn't go in the future and try to spin it one way or another for their own personal gain. That's why Patti's so important, because people have already forgotten the start of women's pro surfing.
Well, that's why we're all here.
Exactly.
So.
and your question concerned making the transition from being a competitive surfer to a surfing promoter, for whatever reasons there are. I've lived a very eclectic life, and it's part of who I am, and I've got a long-term attention deficit disorder, and I get to a certain point in what I'm doing, and I want to leave the field of battle a winner. And so I won the World Surfing Championships and said to myself, well, what now? Well, what else am I going to do? Continue and then someday be, unlike Kelly Slater, someone who loses. And I left. But I also saw a need, which I wrote about in Surfer Magazine, to advance surfing. And not only advance surfing professionally as a profession and financially, but also advance the sport. And the greatest, highest echelons of sport is professional sports. So I thought it would really advance the sport with the caliber of surfing, with the motive to, and the time and the money to really achieve the next level. And as we all know, in professional sports, you achieve the very pinnacle of performance. Professional car drivers have cars that eventually, 50 years later become the state of art in street cars, not 50 years. But so those were my motives, and I basically retired from competitive surfing and started the brought the Smirnoff Pro-Am to Hawaii, which Randy surfed in, believe it or not.
Yeah.
We innovated a lot of interesting things. The Mobile Surf Contest.
Do you remember, Fred, what the prize money was at that first event in 1970?
I remember it was very little.
Yeah,
and I used to get a lot of complaints about that.
Yeah.
No, it was actually a $5,000 purse, which at the time was a lot of money. You got to realize it's 1970, and 5,000 went a long way. So that was a big deal, because Smirnoff had actually sponsored an event in Santa Cruz in 1969, but the water was cold and the waves weren't that big, and so they opted to move to the North Shore. And so, as Fred pointed out, he retired as a competitive surfer. Actually, Fred, I remember he's still competing a little bit in '69, and a couple of events.
Some fun things.
Yeah, but in terms of Fred basically got going as a promoter, and the first main event was to bring Smirnoff, move it from California over to Hawaii and establish that event. And as Fred pointed out, I was actually lucky enough to be one of the, I think it was 24 or 32 of us invited to that event. And so that was the first kind of really organized pro event. You got to realize there had been money in events prior to that. The Duke Classic on the North Shore started in '65, And in 1968, Kimo gave away $1,000,
At the urging of Larry Lindbergh.
which was a big deal in 68 to get $1,000 to win a surf contest. That was like today, getting a $50,000 prize was like a lot of money. And then, but there was no organized surfing, so Fred saw the need for that and brought together a sponsor who was keen to do something, and the idea being to establish the event. So the first real pro event was basically the Smirnoff, even though there had been money prior to that.
Now, there had been, surfing contests had been held all over the place from the 1950s.
Pro.
Not pro, but just surfing contests.
No, there actually were some pro events where things were given away. It's really important contextually in history to like who discovered America? Well, obviously Leif Erikson, but we don't say that. We say Christopher Columbus. So it's not only discovering something or starting something, it's making it endure. We didn't really start the first pro surfing organization, Randy Burke. There's a predecessor organization, IPSA, but it amounted to nothing. So, it's not only starting something, it's making it happen that really gives it substance and enduring historical value. We did a lot of things. We invited the first women to compete professionally in the Smirnoff. Patti was one of the first women professional surfers. So we planted those seeds, and those seeds grew. That's the main thing.
Patti, tell us a little bit about that. You were growing up in Hawaii?
Yes.
And surfing in some of these early professional events?
The Smirnoff was a all-male event, and Fred invited one woman to surf in a heat with men. In my heat were Eddie Eichow, Al Chapman, Terry Fitzgerald, and Sammy Hawk. And then I think Jonathan Parman from South Africa did not show up. And he sent us out to very big waves. It was 12 to 15 foot sunset. That's Hawaiian standards, judging from the back of the wave. So his idea was to, I guess it was, we had complained to him that he was making all these contests for men, but there had been none for women. And so that's when I met Fred. But that was later. That was 74 or 5, the first year for women.
Wasn't the year before that when didn't Laura Blair's get?
Yes, the first year was Laura Blair's Ching.
We invited Laura Blair's Ching to be a one woman in the Smirnoff Pro-Am. And quite frankly, I didn't do it for gender politically correct purposes. I saw this as a business opportunity, that we have to expand the base and horizon of the sport to make it grow, and that there was this whole market there that really had great potential, and that was women surfing. So if I was going to sell at that time I was trying to sell these events to network television too, and they're all the way out here, so it made economic sense. If you go back with the Pipeline Masters, go back with the Women's Masters. If you're going to sell the World Cup to CBS, sell the World Cup men and women, and there's economies of scale to it. So it was a larger decision based on a number of things, not just gender equity. And I hope Patti and I get into it on camera. Women were a pain in the butt.
Fred was a pain in the butt.
I mean, coming to me and saying, we're women, we deserve the same amount of prize money as the men. Remember all that, Randy? I mean, it's just...
just before we go into that, what I think is, just to finish the kind of a timeline here, was, so pro surfing really got going with the Smirnoff in Hawaii. As Fred mentioned, there was other contests, and there was attempts at pro events starting to happen in the early 70s. But Fred started the Smirnoff. There was the Duke Classic, which had been running since the mid-60s, so that event was another event that grew into stature. In 71, the next year after the Smirnoff, Fred started the Pipeline Masters, which is still going to this day. It's the longest running professional event in the world. And so then 72...
I actually got criticized by some people in surfing for that.
Yeah.
There's actually a guy in Hawaii that been a pain in my ass for years. I won't mention his name, but he actually wrote a letter to the paper saying that I was jeopardizing surfers' lives for making an event at the Pipeline. So it's an interesting, all the battles you had to go through to,
Yeah, but so the men in Hawaii were really established because we had the Smirnoff, we had the Duke Classic, and we now have the Pipeline Masters. So three really, in those days, strong professional events. And so men's surfing was looking really good. It was growing. Short boards had come in, and so the interest was growing with it. And competitive surfing here in California actually was on a decline, but in Hawaii, because of the big waves, it was on the increase. And so I think that it was 73, if I'm correct, that Fred invited Laura to surf in the Smirnoff. And it's funny because she actually beat one of the guys. I think it was a 6-person heat, and she came in 5th, and one of the guys came 6th, and that guy, to this day, has been devastated, believe me.
I know who he is.
Yeah.
Yes.
We won't say any names.
No.
So really, that was and it generated a lot of interest, and it was definitely a novelty factor to some extent. I mean, Fred was right, there was need for the women there, and it wasn't really till we established the world tour in the mid-70s that Patti came in and the really thing got going. So I just wanted to kind of give a little timeline there that there was professional events on the North Shore since '65, basically like I said, the old Duke Classic. Really, the Smirnoff, I think,
Well,
was
the
the
Duke
first.
didn't get money till '67.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But there was events there, and then really, it didn't get going with prize money guarantee till Smirnoff was really the first real one.
Now, at the same time, early 73, 74, that into the mid-70s period, there were other events taking place in other countries around the world with growing into professional contests too, in Australia, in South Africa, and elsewhere. Were you monitoring that situation, Fred?
Well, we actually, first let me step back just for a second and tell you that, because Randy touched on it, there weren't many events in California. Surfing was also going through what I call growing pains. I had to fight a whole movement within surfing that, and I stood at the tip of the spear of the development of professional surfing, that surfing was an art form, and that there was no room for competitive surfing, much less competitive surfing. I had a guy write a magazine article that said I was fornicating with Mother Sea. So there was a movement within surfing not to have professional surfing, and of course there was a simple reply to that. It can be, surfing's whatever you make it. That's one of the true appeals of the sport is there's no boundaries to it. So if you want to be professional and competitive and athletic, you can. If you want to be an artist, you can. And if you want to play by the rules, you can. If you don't, if you want to be a recreational surfer, you can. But there was actually a battle out there too. I mean, am I correct, Randy? There were guys who were criticizing me for.
That was kind of during the soulful period, the early '70s, when everybody here in California was wearing a black wetsuit, and everybody had long hair, and everybody's boards were boringly
Clear.
bland, and competitive surfing was seen as being sort of anti-soulful.
Yeah.
The '60s, the longboard era of the '60s, where there had been a lot of competitions, amateur events here in California, had fallen by the wayside, and competitive surfing had really fallen out of favor here in California particularly. So there was no real movement here in California, any push to really make competitive surfing happening. And I think with the introduction of money, professionalism changed it. And we were on the forefront of that by bringing the money to Hawaii. We had the waves, we had the TV contracts, and it really was lagging in Southern California, whereas Hawaii kind of took the form. But you're right, Paul, there was events in South Africa. There were events going on in Australia, quite a few there. And most of these were all amateur events that were just starting to think, striving to figure out a way to...
Gunston 500.
Yeah, the Gunston had given away, it was called the Gunston 500 because they gave away 500 Rand, which was the currency in South Africa at the time. And 500 Rand was probably $2,000 at that stage. I think in Bells Beach, they finally gave away money in like 72 or 74, I believe it was. And
73, I think it was 73.
73, somewhere right in there. Yeah, they were a couple of years behind us in Hawaii, but they finally realized, they had to start giving money away. So the movement was starting to happen. There was all of a sudden this money was coming in, and it wasn't a lot, but it seemed like a lot for the time. Mm-hmm. And I think Fred had the forefront of that because of having been a competitor himself in the amateur longboard days, and then switching over and beginning to get it going. So Hawaii became the center, and the Australians wanted to come compete in Hawaii, the South Africans wanted to come compete in Hawaii, and that was the beginning of how we were going to move forward. This, as Fred said, it was a business for him. It was not going to be an association. It was not going to be a surfers union. It was going to be a way to promote these events. He had TV contracts with the various American networks, and that was a way to turn this into a viable promotion.
Actually, I was pretty proud of that on the television side of it. I had television contracts with the 3 major networks, and of course this was before cable TV, so there was the 3 major networks and that was it. I had more sports time being broadcast out of Hawaii than any other sports entity, including the Hawaiian Open and Hula Bowl. So the sport had a appeal beyond the immediate surfing market. It had an aesthetic appeal and a sports appeal on television. When Randy came and said, let's start the circuit, we literally, it's kind of an interesting sports story because I literally just picked up the phone, and it was very hard to make a long distance phone call. And I called Peter Burness, and I called Bill Bowman in Australia, and I called around the world and said, would you agree to these terms, and you know, would you let us rank your contest? But it was 76, so the contests were all mostly done, and so we went back and said, yeah, well, these guys are now on the pro circuit. And by the way, the champion this year is Peter Townend because he did the most on this point system we have. But there was a lot of irony in that whole thing that it came about and was done retro. And Patty, I forgot how we got the women off the ground.
Yeah,
well,
this
I
was-
think this is established, and it'll flow into that. What had happened is I had been traveling for 2 years around the world and got to all these places and got to know these different promoters and actually competed. I was actually a competitor at that stage in the events. And I had left Hawaii in 72, 73, and came back in 74, early 75. And having been gone for 2 years, I had sort of dropped off the radar on the North Shore. And I came back and I couldn't get in my event in Hawaii. And I was really frustrated. I said, you know, I'm still very competitive. Just because I've been traveling for 2 years and I was out of sight for 2 years, doesn't mean I got to be a worse surfer. I should still be in this. So I actually went to Fred and I said, if we have a elimination event,
Start Pro Class Trials.
will you let 6 guys get into your Smirnoff event? And he says, okay, well, you organized this. So Bernie Baker and myself, we got together and formatted this, what was called the Pro Class Trials. And that became the first qualifying event. Well, it glaringly made it obvious that there had to be some system established to allow, not just myself, but it was very self-serving at the time, a means for the surfers from around the world to qualify to get into these professional events. Because prior to that, it was like how many pictures you had in a magazine, did you know the promoter, who did you chum
Well, actually,
up
it was a
to?
little more substantive, Randy.
Yeah.
I think we have the same issue somewhat. Fred was the first to put the women on television, but when he picked Laura, and she's an excellent surfer, but it was somewhat arbitrary. She had been in Playboy magazine, so she had some fame, if you will, outside the surfing world. And so the women, we were not happy that of all of us, that he had arbitrarily picked a woman to represent us. So we formed an organization called the Hawaii Women's Surfing Hui. And in that organization were myself, it was, we got a grant from an organization called Sea Grant, which is a federal funding organization. It wasn't for much.
Thanks to you, Patty.
No, thanks to Linda. And Rel Sun, Sally Prang, Lynn Boyer, these were all the very first women surfers. Margot joined, although she was on Kauai, but it was really about 20 to 30 women surfers in Hawaii, all of the best women surfers. And we said, somebody's going to need to go talk to Fred. And somehow, it was me. Nobody wanted to do it, but somehow it was me. So I cold called him and introduced myself. He invited me to lunch, remember, at the Outrigger. And I remember the first words out of his mouth were, who are you and why are you telling me what to do with my contests?
That's a good question.
You know, I guess it was a personal capitalistic venture, but at the time we felt that we need some sort of system here, just like Randy felt that there was no way to pick the women or no way to judge who should qualify for the World Cup because the invitations just went out based on reputation. And so at some point though, he held the first Women's World Cup and he asked us, I think you asked us to rate the women. I think we got to give you some names. You picked some, and then some came from California. And while we were waiting for that World Cup, the women in California actually got together with WISA, Women's International Surfing Association, and put on a pro contest in September of, I think it was 75. And so that really was the first all-woman contest, but it really went nowhere. I think after that, they held another contest and another. But really, after that, then we joined the pro circuit and we had a sister organization with the men's organization. Randy ran the men's, but I'm getting ahead of us now, and I ran the women's. So, but that's how we got absorbed.
This goes back to the Smirnoff and my criterion. I basically was doing it all by myself. I'd sit down. My criterion was multifaceted. If I just invited the best surfers, it'd probably be just most of the guys from Hawaii, maybe a few from California, and maybe a few from Australia, because I was in Hawaii, and we made a mobile. We were the first guys to implement a mobile contest. If I have a contest at 20-foot Waimea Bay, you better know how to surf, and so I couldn't. But I also had another criterion was helping market the sport. Hence Laura Blair. She was a known name. If I invited Patty, she probably wouldn't have got as much coverage, albeit she was a better surfer, than Laura did. And Laura, for a couple of big reasons, probably would have got more.
Laura's a wonderful surfer.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Randy,
Anyway, the point is, I invited every year guys that probably shouldn't have even been in the water. I invited, in fact, one year I invited a guy that wouldn't go in the water because the waves are so big. But I invited the best surfer at the time from Japan, Doji Isaka, the best surfer from England. I had a guy from England, the best guy from the East Coast at the time, and I'm not going to mention his name to embarrass him, but at one event he wouldn't go in the water because they were too big. And I said, you know what? You're a very smart man and you're very courageous because you have the courage to admit to yourself that if you go out there, you might get killed. And he didn't go in the water. So the criterion was, besides best surfers, if it was just best surfers, it would have been a very limited field. It was also marketing and spreading the sport and giving it international. Because, for instance, Doji Isaka went back to Japan and kind of really became kind of the George Washington of surfing. And so it had other motives besides just having the best surfers.
Nevertheless, it was becoming clear that, and I think, Randy, you were about to embark on this, that there was a need for a system that would establish a worldwide ranking
Objective.
for
And I agree.
who the top surfers really were.
Right. Well, that's so. Part of it was just personal motivation to get into the Hawaiian events, but also it became clear that we needed a way to figure out a system, some kind of a rating system, and be able to quantify these events. And so in '76, I had returned from South Africa. It was the middle of the year, it was summertime. Approached Fred with the idea of this, and he said, okay, let's do it. And then, so we went, okay, we got hold of the different promoters from the different areas, and we retroactively gave a system where we counted the results from New Zealand, from Australia, from South Africa. And
California, wasn't there?
I think there was maybe one California event, and coming up was the Hawaiian season. So basically, the ratings were in place before we even started the Hawaiian season, and nobody knew that it was going to be a ratings. And we came up with a system that we kind of patterned after sort of basic tennis seeding, pretty much. And so going into the Hawaiian season,
actually Randy came up with that. And we just agreed on it.
Yeah, and it was just it was a system that we eventually got modified. We had input from guys like PT and Ian Cairns and those guys. All, once it got going, everybody jumped on board and wanted.
Randy, I think it's important that you see the subtlety of the tug and pull between Randy and I, because Randy and I are very, very different people in a lot of ways, but we're very similar in other. Randy wanted to do this point system. I said, it's a bunch of math. I mean, guys got to get out the calculators. I wanted to do it by money because I figured that would induce sponsors to put more money in the contest because they want to be, the big magnet in the sport. So it was.
Let me just clarify. So, in the system you were supporting the world champion would have been the person who won the most money that year.
Yeah, and I thought that for marketing purposes and development purposes probably would have been a better way. Well, obviously Randy was right over the long haul. So, the reason I brought it up is because I wanted to show you that we were doing something that had never been done before. You know, Patti was advancing a concept of women's pro surfing. Well, give me a break, women pro surfing. We were developing a sport that it's not like we were doing something, well, we're going to do something that he did, or, you know, we're going to make a new model car or something. We're doing something, we're basically building a new car. We're inventing something that never been done before. So in a certain way, it was trial and error, but fortunately, I think we had more success. But that's the kind of thing we did. You know, like Randy said, oh no, we got to do the point system.
Once we got the men's system down and we voted, the women came on board because the South Africans had invited like a demonstration of the women surfers, and then we had a contest in did we go to Rio that first year? Or was it
Yeah, actually, Randy asked for a meeting of the women,
Right.
remember, on a picnic bench in Mokuleia. And we all showed up from around the island, and he said, we want to bring you. I thought it was because we needed to sell more seats on the airplane, you know, for your tour. But
Sure didn't hurt.
yeah, but he had arranged to have a women's events in South Africa and in Rio de Janeiro, and he said, we want you to come along on the tour. This will be a women's tour. There were two events for us, one in East London,
East London,
the
right.
Gunston 500, and one at Umhlanga Rocks in Durban, I can't remember the
I
name.
think Hang 10 was a sponsor.
Yeah, Hang 10.
Hang 10, yeah.
And then flying to Rio for, I think, was that another? Oh, for the Rico Women's Pro, and that was 1976.
So we'd established this rating system because of support for the South Africans and the guys in Brazil. We established women, and then we had women's events coming up in the winter season in Hawaii. So we needed somebody to organize all this. Well, of course, since I was the guy who proposed it, Fred says, well, look, you do the work, and you know, I'll count everything. And so I became the first world tour director. And Patti, even though she was a competitor, and actually I think I was still competing in the first 2 years of the tour, we both were competing, but at the same time organizing. So she took on the role of organizing the women. They already had the local Hawaiian women's group, and it just expanded to include this international group. And so the idea was to encourage the promoters of the events to add women's divisions where possible to the existing men's events.
It's important that you understand also the economics. I was making money by my events. I sold the events to network TV, sold sponsorship, gave out the prize money, paid the producer, whatever was left over I made it. It was a profit, which in the early years, I underwrote the first pipeline out of my pocket. You know, it's speculating, all business people, you know, a lot of the communists in the world forget that businesses start small and oftentimes are bankrolled out of people's own pockets and most go bankrupt. So it really wasn't much money in the sport, is I guess what I'm saying, for guys like me in the early days. And the last thing in the world I wanted to do was bankroll this organization that really had no intrinsic value as far as generating money. It was like a service organization. So we were very, very careful in how we did, at least I was, in how we did things, because I was basically paying for it. You know, Randy was executive director. Randy, how much were you making?
I think I'm making $5 a month.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, I paid your postage.
$200 for the fall.
Did
I
you?
found my old letters before I came here.
You got paid too much.
$200.
You mean for Randy?
So,
Randy
yeah,
got
I was the executive
So I
director
guess
for the women.
It was.
and Randy was for
It
the
really
men.
was in the early days
Labor of love.
labor of love, and it was an uphill battle. It really was, And we charged. God, I'll never forget this. I think we charged membership to help offset some of the communication other costs. Like it was like.
Yes.
$5.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
it $5? I mean,
And I
that's
got guys that bitched about it. $5.
$5 to join this? I could pay $5?
I still have the membership rosters at home.
Yeah.
There were certainly challenges in those early
Yeah, we
days.
made a little card
Patty.
that had International Professional Surfing on it.
Yeah,
You got
I
it?
have that.
Remember you got the
I
card?
still have the
You that
stationery.
card?
I do.
I know that
Is it
you know,
on- is it
while,
signed?
while all this was going on, the number of men's events was growing somewhat steadily. Not quite so for the women's events, though, at the time. But what were some of the special challenges that the women felt they were up against in the development of pro surfing?
I think it was the money, and this is sort of a fundamental philosophical argument, I guess, that I think we've always had, and that is that we would
Who's
pay
we?
the same. I think the women.
You and me.
Okay, I don't.
Yeah, let's be a little more, you know.
I think
Hey,
what would
how long
happen
has
is
this argument been going on?
we would pay the same amount. Oh, since that first meeting at the Outrigger.
40 years, 50 years.
But he's coming along. We would pay the same amount of money for our boarding pass to go travel for. But when we got there, the prize money was significantly lower. Fred always said, "Well, you have to surf better and surf bigger waves." My contention was the majority of the advertisement, the majority of the thousands of people that showed up in Rio de Janeiro, the maximum advertising exposure was to come and see us for whatever reason, maybe because we were, unusual in their eyes. So if we're talking about advertising exposure, which Fred has said was a major factor in his selecting candidates, so to use his own logic, then I thought he should have, and the candidate and the sponsor should have, in fact, paid us more. But when we showed up in South Africa, Chapstick was the sponsor of the Gunston 500. They announced that they didn't have any money, and they asked if they could do a raffle in their country and raffle off one of us for a date and use the money to pay for our contest. We were furious. We went into talks with them. It was a horrible experience, but then
How was
I
the
think they
date, Patty?
came up with a $300 or $400, I think.
How
for
was
the
the date,
whole-
Patty?
How was what?
Did you have fun on the date?
On the day?
On a date.
On the contest? Oh, the day? Oh. Yeah, we forgot to show up. How about that?
Let me-
There was another
Same
thing
thing
too.
happened in
I-
the next two contests. We never got what they had promised us.
But this is an interesting point that she brings up, and it's a battle going, and I know and appreciate her point of view, but this goes right down to the battle of the sexes and the women's revolution and everything. They'd come to me and say, "Fred, we want equal pay with the men." And I said, "Yeah, I believe in equal pay for equal work." I said, "The men get more money because a lot of it's coming from the surfing industry, as fledgling as it was, because men do more work." "What do you mean? We surf too, we ride." I said, "Okay, if you want equality, here's a couple things we could do. Number one is, we'll just get rid of women surfing and you guys surf with the men. That's true equality, equal opportunity.
That was the Smirnoff.
Same
That
prize,
was-
same prize money, same everything else." Well, you know how that would end up. They get no prize money because the men were totally dominated. Is that a fair assumption?
Not
Okay.
to that.
Okay.
Do I get to answer?
No. And the other thing was, is that people come to surfing contests for a number of reasons, and maybe some of them come to see pretty ladies, but they ultimately come to see athletic prowess at its best. And in Hawaii, that means riding waves that could kill you. So I asked actually Patty was very diplomatic. Rel's son and Jericho Popper were the two Nazis, and they were part of that.
They're not Nazis.
I'm just making it.
Okay.
It's just a play on words. But they were saying, "We want our money," it's like shaking their fist at me, and they were pissed off and all that stuff. I said, "Okay, equal work, equal pay. Yeah, we equal work. We're surfers. We want equal pay with the men." I said, "Okay. Next time it's 20 feet in Waimea Bay, like it was in the 1974 Smirnoff, I'm sending you out."
Well, we went out to very big waves in Fred's contest. But let me just say, Jericho and Rel, not Nazis, really after I left IPS a couple of years later, then there was a void, and then they went on to form WPS, Women's Pro Surfers, so that they had an organization run by them. I think they felt that they could do more for the sport.
Did they?
But we did go. Look where we are today. We did go out in big waves. Stop making faces.
12-foot sunset.
We did go out in
Compared
large
to
waves. We
30
went
foot
out,
wide man?
competed against the men in the Smirnoff. We went out whenever you arranged for us to go out. The problem we had was they would always send the women out when the waves were smaller and windier and blown out. We were always sort of second-class citizens.
Well, let me ask you truthfully now, Patty, since we've been in this argument for 45 years now. If I call the contest the morning of the Smirnoff in basically ways that could kill you, and which a lot of surfers didn't want to go out because it was too big, would any of the women gone out at 25 or 30-foot Waimea?
A couple of them would have.
Yeah, thank you. I remember
Yeah.
my Smirnoff, it started out,
Oh, I think Margot would have gone up for sure.
Margot beat BK in one heat, didn't she, the following year?
Well, I
Hey,
mean,
Barry, can I have pony?
Would I have had a contest?
We're here to kind of divulge the history,
Yeah.
not.
Well, no, this
Thank
is
you.
part of the history, because this is part of the give and take and the marketing concerns of getting a sport launched, and
yeah,
you
sure.
know,
But I
and
think-
what- I guess what I'm saying is, women's surfing had to survive and prosper under different terms than the men because it was a different sport.
Yeah, and that's
That's,
where
I think, the major point.
I was just going to go with that. Patty and I both would go on the tour, and she would take care of the women's interest, add up the points, and any details or things that had to do with the women. She's basically the spokesman. I was similar for the men, and we're talking 76, 77, 78 in that era. This is the fledgling early days of pro surfing. We started the pro tour in 76 with the IPS rankings. Peter Townend was the first champion. Then really the first full season was 77, where we had a schedule ahead of time. Everybody knew a year in advance what they were going to compete in. And there was women's events as well. And Patty was in charge of taking care of, and trying to advance this whole argument that we just went through here. Why women shouldn't have a more equal money and stature and everything else as the men. And the men's tour took off. We got Pan Am as our sponsor. We had Rolex as our sponsor. And from an image point of view, it was looking really good. 77 was the first good year. The Stubby started in Australia, that first man-on-man.
Great guy, Bill Bowman.
Man-on-man competitions.
Very good.
And it was, in a lot of the events that added a women's division, there wasn't as many women competitors. And that was one of the arguments, was it's in proportion. The prize money is greater for the men because there's more men competitors than there are women competitors. That was an argument that was utilized to justify why the women's purse was a little bit less. And I think it was a case of marketing. And the irony of this is, here it is 40 years later, and it still holds
Still
true
the
today.
same.
It has not changed. The dynamics, sure, there's more prize money for women's surfers. They're making a lot more money, and the talent level in women's surfing is tremendous. But really, the argument and the proportionment of it is still pretty much the same.
And it's a fundamental truth that there's sponsors that won't invest in it. You know,
And this puzzles me because if you
Wasn't
look at
my fault.
Roxy, I mean, they're in the $1 billion range, selling to women, women's clothing, and yet women still, here 40 years later, and they still can't
Well,
get the kind of sponsorship and prize money that men do.
And I think it's worth mentioning for the record that women have ridden some really big waves
Yes,
in the
yes.
intervening years. I mean,
Yes.
a few women have ridden a few big waves,
Yeah.
but can you send out 32 women out at Waimea Bay on a 30-foot day to have a contest?
The idea here is, that argument's is just as valid now as it was 40 years ago. But I think that the important thing is what Patty established. We're talking women specifically here. You look at the Women's World Tour now, and there is a career path for the best competitive women surfers to do well and get paid well for what they're doing. And the early beginnings is what we're trying to establish here. And that was back in 1976. And Patty had to be a competitor. You had to wear a lot of hats in those days. You'd be a competitor, come in, take care of administration, and try to further the growth of women's surfing as well. And of course, the men would always go, get rid of the chicks. What are these
Yeah.
girls
Oh,
doing?
That's right.
that's another thing we had to deal with.
They
A lot of guys came to me because I was
That's
kind of like the guy at the tip of the spear once again and said, "Why are you wasting the money? And what do you do with the chicks, man? It's just a waste of time, man." It was like,
I have to say, Randy always helped me, though. We worked collaboratively very well, and when he would find sponsors sometimes, and I wasn't able to, it was a lot harder for me, he would a lot of times, shift some of the money toward us. I remember Metropolitan New York Life, they gave us some money to help with our tour, and I always appreciated that.
it's always perplexing to me why, and to this day, it's still true. I'm far removed from the machinations of the day-to-day operation of surf. Why women's surfing doesn't get more sponsorship? And maybe Patty, you can.
Probably because the people making the decisions for the sponsorship are men. Sorry, but it's like look at women's basketball. Why don't they? I don't know what the answer is. I just know that they.
I think it's just
don't.
a case. The trouble with
They're not interested.
in my opinion, women's sports marketing is really tough because the general consumer does not really identify with a women competitor like they do a man.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the trend that 40 years ago applied. I think in the first days, the novelty factor was there, the uniqueness of wanting to see women compete and what have you.
I'm not going to compromise who I am. I'm Fred Hemmings. Here's the reason why, and this is why Randy and I work so well together. Randy's very diplomatic with that answer. The reason is because women are not as good athletes as men.
I
And
disagree.
I just saw it the other day with my daughter running the marathon. My
This is
daughter,
terrible.
we looked at the winning times, and the man's time was 15 minutes faster than the woman's. So, I tell my daughter,
We're not going to settle this.
but my point,
We're not.
my point is that if you're in a state of denial about that, you'll never advance your concept.
I don't want to
Right.
further
Let-
this,
let me-
but let me just finish it with this. Bigger isn't always better, despite what Fred might think in terms of the way. Surfing is an art form. And I
Is
think,
that-
I
is
think
that the
women
one-
surf equally as well. And, you know, he can sell it any way you want to a sponsor, but let's just move on to the history.
The fact is, both men, professional surfing for both men and women has evolved by huge degrees since these early days we've been talking about.
Yes.
Well, that's,
But having said that,
We'll drop it. Let's drop it.
from those early beginnings, things did get a little more complicated. The more there were international competitors traveling around the world, there were competing interests of different promoters who had different ideas than yours, Fred, on how to run an event. And ultimately, this wonderful organization that you and
ASP
Randy
took over.
had established kind of had to deal with a rising number of people in factions who disagreed with some of the ways you were doing things.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, Fred made it very clear in the very beginning, it was a business for him. It was a business opportunity that Fred utilized competitive surfing to further his business interests. When it came to a point where those businesses were either jeopardized or no longer viable, the entity known as Association of Surfing Professionals superseded International Professional Surfing. IPS was not an organization, it was not an association,
And we walked
it
away
wasn't
from
a
it.
unit. And Fred basically seceded that, not willingly, but just by the fact that it had to happen. And I think what happened, the ASP World Tour, as it now is an evolution of those early 80s. And I resigned as the tour director because I no longer wanted to deal with it. It became much more political, and it became motivated by different factions. But it has gone through trials and tribulations, and today the Pro Tour is alive and well. And it's interesting that the early foundings that we set up were the basis by which we're pro surfing out. Now it's a $3-4 million tour each year. The women's circuit is
The administrative costs are
well, and plus prize money. Yeah. And the point being that it has evolved from those early beginnings. And I think this is what we're here today is to establish, because otherwise people forget. And so the IPS was really the first pro organization. We declared the first pro champion for both ladies and men's. That evolved into the ASP in 1983. ASP has gone on to establish it. And the events that Fred's basically started are still going in Hawaii. And so that's a tribute to the fact that his vision, and as he said earlier, people were down on it. There was people that were really down on pro surfing. They just thought we were raping and pillaging the soulness of the sport. Well, now it's created a career path for young surfers, both male and female. Now it has established itself as, like I said, about a $4 million circuit worldwide. You know, surfing is taking place in about 50 countries now, and you know, there's competitive surfing going around the world. So.
Actually, Paul, I have to say, I'm astounded by how much it's grown financially, and I'm quite proud of what ASP's done and what they've done. But what it's done is something more important to me than the money and the business and all the falderall that goes along with it. It has changed the image of the sport. And one of the motives I had as a young man, and we didn't get into this, but when I won the World Surfing Championship, I was not part of the pop culture. You know, that surfers were this kind of counterculture cult. And I had short hair, and I went to the world. I deliberately put a suit on to just basically give my finger to all the Cheech and Chong's in the room, looking through the haze of marijuana smoke. And as a result, I was highly motivated to elevate the stature of surfing. And I am very proud to be sitting here today, 45 years later, and say that a guy like Kelly Slater is not only one of the world's greatest athletes, but he's also one of the world's greatest young men because of the content of his character. And surfing's had its problems with a lot of, since then, a lot of, drugs and trouble and indictments and things like that, but so's every other sport. But surfing now is in the pantheon of great sports. It is a great worldwide sport. And Randy mentioned something that is astounding to me, and I just would have never dreamed it. When I was in the state senate, I had a group, Surfing the Nations, which is an organization of basically Christian surfers. And they brought into my office the number one surfer in Bangladesh. So surfing is touching the shores of not only the world's great oceans, but of cultures rich and poor. It really has become something that all of us should be very, very proud of as a sport.
I think that was the motivation, Fred, as a business, and myself joining him, was you have to look at, when I was a kid growing up in the 60s, they called us surf bums. Mm-hmm. And I always irked me to no end to be called a surf bum.
Me too, man. It got me so.
Me too.
And I really felt that by establishing professional surfing and the credibility that it would bring with it, we would get rid of that moniker. And now you look at somebody like Kelly Slater, and people go, wow, he's a pro surfer. Mm-hmm. And so we went from a surf bum to accepted to be a pro surfers, and there's lawyers and doctors and all kinds of business people who surf recreation now, and they aren't considered surf bums. Yep. Yeah. And so that, to me, that's probably one of our biggest contributions to establishing pro surfing, is pro surfing legitimized surfing. Prior to that, it was basically a lifestyle sport, and it wasn't really accepted as a sport until pro surfing came along. Pro surfing solidified it as a sport, and it is still a lifestyle. There's no question.
And it was hard. We may have floundered at first to hear us talk, but I think it was Fred's vision and Randy's work ethic and mine and our vision as well that eventually brought it, at least to have a path forward.
We planted seeds.
We were clumsy, maybe getting it off the ground at some times, but
yeah, I mean, if you think about the first
there
year,
was no model.
I was writing the tour ratings on napkins.
Yeah.
And keeping them on a napkin and carrying those with me, and then at the end of the
PT
year,
still got it.
yeah, he probably does. And
Well, if we'd done PT's rating, you wouldn't have been champion.
that's true.
You realize that?
I didn't
PT
know that.
and ASP had a rating system, and if we had used it the first year,
he wouldn't have been
PT wouldn't have been the champion.
Patty, do you have anything else in closing? I think we covered the basics. I mean, I think
we did.
I think the important thing here was just this was the establishment of the first pro surfing tour, both ladies and gentlemen, and it started in 1976, and that was the first. It actually started in 75, but the first world tour was decided in 76. Mm-hmm. And International Professional Surfing, IPS as it was known, was definitely the governing and the body that drove it forward until it was superseded by the ASP in 1983. The ASP counts back to 1976 now. There's no reference to IPS, and it's I guess a footnote in history now, because ASP does run things. But the fact is, Fred's vision of what pro surfing could be, and Patty's and my early administration established the groundwork for which the pro tour is in existence today.
Yeah, I'd say
Bravo.
that's accurate.
And one last thing. Do you remember the quote that he did when we were in Queensland? What Paul said, remember? He said, one day.
Yeah.
I love that quote. Actually, that brings us full circle to where we began, and that's why this interview is so
No,
important.
but say the quote.
In some way,
I say
history.
one day, when the history books are written, your role as the founder of pro surfing will be recognized, Fred.
And that was 1977. I think it was, it was one of the early
Said that?
Then he
studies.
said, but you'll have to die first.
No, but it's interesting.
That's when they were trying to throw you out.
But Paul, reason I brought that up is because that was your quote when we were at one of the IPS meetings there on the Gold Coast, and you'd had a few rum and cokes, I think, at that stage. But
Probably.
But you were very profound in what you said about Fred, and here we are 40 years later, and that has come true.
Little did I know that was going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy of mine. And I'd be here doing this
Well, it's
interview.
important history. It's important that history.
But let's say Craig wants to do the deal
Yeah.
with Freddie, so
I got to thank Randy, and so it's on
Okay,
record
guys,
here,
say-
Randy and Patti for everything they did in the early days to get it going. And they had a difficult task because they started out as competitors, and so they had to. In fact, Patti had to wear two hats for a while, both as a competitor and as an administrator. And Randy made the transitional jump, but without them, we wouldn't be here now.
Right. Very good.
all right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If you'd like to support the work of the Surfing Heritage Foundation, contact us at surfingheritage.org.